The Austin Gnostic Society is an organization that was founded in 1928 by followers of Madame Blavatsky, who, as the Theosophical Society had become more and more involved with the study of all of the modalities of the East, India particularly, and Hinduism and Buddhism, the ideas of reincarnation, of karma, all of these ideas that came to the West with incredible excitement. They came and really offered an alleviation to the present reality of basically when you go away, when you die, well, you're going to go down there. Because the idea of being able to ascend to higher realms was just unrealistic for so many. Because part of the problem with the West and of the monolithic dogmatic conception of Western religious culture is that you're no good. It ain't going to work out. So this proposition of some alternative that Theosophy brought in the West was greatly appreciated and I think well received. The Gnostic Society were members of Theosophy who actually had the idea that as far as these new modalities that are coming, as far as these opportunities for kind of spiritual transcendence that goes beyond the limitations of the dogma of the church, was that we already had Western modalities at our disposal. Particularly, we had the Western mystery tradition. That being, for example, Freemasonry, all of the occult streams of magic, Rosicrucianism, the Kabbalah, and then all of the secret societies. And so it was set apart from the Western course and direction of Theosophy for being the treasury that we already possess, that has been in the shadows and been hidden, and is particularly devoted to bringing these possibilities into consciousness. Because let's face it, we are not Easterners. Those modalities were received, but the way people accept and deal with things like yoga is different than it's dealt with in the East. For instance, you go to a strip mall in yoga and it's a form of exercise. It's a form of, some kind of health and fitness. It has very little to do with spiritual transcendence. So, and then other ideas of reincarnation and karma and all these things, they're understood in their own way in the West, which is different from the East. So essentially, we have in our DNA, wired as Westerners, this symbolic system of the Western mystery tradition, which is basically antiquity on, as really the root of our being and a way of achieving and attaining to some level of transcendence, some level of spiritual liberation from the difficulties that we face. And so to take advantage of that in a meaningful way is really the purpose of the society where you are now. So we, today in the Gnostic Society, we have programs and lectures that pertain to this Western mystery tradition, but specifically, it's not a book report. It's not merely some sort of arcane way of looking at these old systems and traditions. But rather, if we can know the original author's intent of the subject to which we're addressing ourselves, that's important. But there is particularly another current that is even more important, which is, how can that be meaningful to me today? How can it be a means of my own spiritual transformation, my own liberation of consciousness today? This is the approach that we take in order to study these things, to bring them into greater awareness, potentially for us to have our own internal exploration of them, and thus an expansion of our own consciousness, of which the ultimate goal is to have a union with the divine. Not merely to think about it, not merely to theorize about it, not just to talk about it, but to actually have the direct experience of God. I'm not ashamed to use that word because it is extremely descriptive and it is our tradition. With that being said, I will address our subject tonight proper. In the preceding meeting, we had discussed magic and witchcraft, and it relates to tonight's subject too, because in fact, in the chronology of the outpouring of the alternative spiritual tradition, the period of history when the condemnation of witches had a particularly Gnostic significance. That being that there were people who, outside of the mainstream paradigm, needed an alternative way of addressing themselves to the inner realities they were experiencing. And that some people availed themselves of the archaic traditions and of the traditions of folk religiosity, and also that of a more organized cultish, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but in a gathering of a tradition of the underground currents in Western Christendom. And many of these people, being outside of the light of the mainstream and dogmatic church, were condemned as witches. So this is a reoccurring theme throughout history, the condemnation of those who are not merely satisfied with the limitations of the exoteric church, of the public and social expression or approach to the divine reality, merely as a social construct, although certainly that's valuable, or merely as a means to somehow ameliorate the deficiency that we experience. I think for far too long, so many of us have been starving for spiritual nourishment, but have been fed straw. And, as I mentioned last month, the dialogue recently discovered between Plato and his student Meto, where it's a very technical, mathematical dialogue of algebraic equations, and Meto, being a young man, keeps expressing to Plato, you don't understand. It has to be like this. It can only be that way. His reason proclaims it has to be 1 + 1 = 2, or A + A = B. There's no getting around it. And in frustration, Plato throws his hands up and says, Meto, I can't talk to you even. You have to first go through the Eleusinian mysteries, and then we can talk to each other. But there is, at that time, the mainstream exoteric church and its exoteric spirituality that was state-sponsored, that you participated in, and participating in, you were expected to. It's part of your duty. It's part of being a citizen. You also gave your reverence to the mainstream movements of spirituality. But for those who needed something more, there was an alternative current known as the mysteries. And the mysteries of Isis and Osiris, Alephsis, Orpheus, and others were for people that needed more than the pageants and the parades and the pat proclamations and declarations of commandments. There were people who needed a direct, powerful experience of the divine. They needed it raw. They needed to feel and to sense with every fiber of their being, and to know, not merely to believe or to have faith. Because let's face it, as William James says, having faith really is having faith in someone else's faith. And now in our culture, things like belief and faith are essentially the same thing. But there is a reality that we can all experience, God willing. And the likelihood is that if you are here, probably you've had those kinds of experiences. Probably going to those halls with all of the beautiful traditions, but without something beyond thinking, something beyond the dogma. Do you require more? That your experience has informed you that there's something else that you haven't received that is your inheritance, that you are entitled to. And that's certainly that kind of person that in all likelihood you are, would have gone to the Eleusinian mysteries, would have gone to the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. Because, this was not, in this period in history, this was not something that had to be done in secret, you should be ashamed of. You want to make sure that it's not on your status update, that's where you've been. You don't have your check-ins to the mysteries of Eleusis. But rather, they were state-sponsored. Certain people have this kind of disposition. It was just acknowledged. Why fight it? Let's make sure that if that's going to be happening, if people need that it is the best it can be. Certainly having those experiences, where you experienced real jeopardy, where you faced the real fire, you felt the heat, you felt all of the senses engaged, that it was necessary, that it wasn't one of these coffee houses where you politely debate with the pinky stuck out. I think maybe it's like this. There's no thinking. At a certain point, the philosophizing has to come to a point of termination, where it says, okay, your ideas, they're interesting. What are you going to do about it? How can I have a proof of this concept? How can I have the experience of this union with the divine? So somehow these modalities were derived, and they lasted a very long time. The ideas are that for instance, the mysteries of Eleusis would into the lesser and the greater mysteries. The lesser mystery being that of you have the confrontation and the realization that you have an immortal soul that is older than anything created, that can never be destroyed, that is superior to the physically manifest reality, that is superior to the limitations of your personality, that will never die, that is ultimately the essence of God poured forth into you, that you are also in miniature, the microcosm of the macrocosm. And then that of the greater mystery, that of the mystery of the travel and the journeying through the cosmogony of the divine, the actual experience of divine beings in resulting ultimately in the communion and the unio mystica of God. This is something that people experienced, and it's said that in conservative estimates that perhaps thousands of people a year went and had these experiences. The experience of initiation, the experience of communion, of the bride chamber, the hieros gamos, the marriage of the soul to the divine. So this is something that existed for a great deal of time. And ultimately, when the mysteries were in a point where they were fading, when the emphasis was lacking, the thing that happened was a period of time called late antiquity. And in these periods, certain movements arose, particularly that of the Neoplatonists, of the Hermeticists, of the Neo-Pythagoreans, and of the Gnostics, all of which sort of picked up the mantle of the mysteries and conferred essentially the same truths, the same kinds of initiations, but particularly in their own individual, more specifically individual kinds of mythos. And they all availed themselves of the same kind of model of reality where the candidate would exemplify the character in a sympathetic relationship to that of the hero. And you have to understand also that the constitution of the human being in this period of history was viewed that of the body. And the body is not just merely an automaton, some kind of golem that we inhabit, but the body has its own kind of intelligence, its own kind of power. That's that kind of a soul of the instincts. That the instincts have their own kind of will unto themselves, their own kind of motivations and desires. Let's face it, if you ignore the body, it ain't going to work out. You know, we need to do something with our body that is not antagonistic towards it. It can't be like, you know, this miserable body, it's totally inferior to my spirit, totally inferior to my divine nature. Well, you know what? It is the vehicle. It is the apparatus, the animated essence that we exist having this experience. So being antagonistic towards it is not the right way. That being said, the body also has its needs. It wants to be fed. And I just dare you, try not feeding your body and see what happens. You know, all of your great, incredible philosophies, all of your spiritual elevations that you're at, you know what, it's going to call rank and say, okay, that's great and everything, but I want a sandwich, you know. And, you know, you should give it a sandwich. You know, it wants those kinds of things. And the body is not divine, but it can be sanctified. It can be sanctified by proper action, proper thought, and a degree of integrity, which is, it's always desirable. So I'll say further, the next part of that constitution is that of the psyche, which translates literally as soul. And so one of the problems we have in the West now, you know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years, there's been conflation with that of the soul and the spirit. And why is this? Well, because it's too complicated. It's not the right way. The soul, the psyche, is the mind, the intellect, the reasoning functions. I'll say this, that you know, people value thinking so much A lot of people, especially if you're a psychological type, is that of a thinking type. It's the most important aspect of your being. But as we know from Jungian analysis and other means, that it's only 1/4 of the reality that you are. And probably not even the most important part. But those things that come from the issuance of thinking, concepts and ideas and ideals, they can really overshadow a lot of people and really usher in a tremendous amount of unconsciousness. I think we see that not only in political motifs, but in interpersonal relationships too. Someone throws up some sort of walls and barriers of their ideals and says, you know what, I can't believe you did this. It's impossible for you to have done this, and it can't be that way. And they totally neglect the reality of the interpersonal relationship with that person. There are other ways that should not be so cold, not so hard and so fast. But the thinking really is represented here. We have at our table of elements the tools of the magician, the tools specifically of ceremonial magic. And what is the object that pertains to air and to thinking? It's the sword. What does the sword do? Well, it makes wounds. So to be very careful how we wield our thinking nature. Now, I would say this: there is far too little of reason being used in our society at this time and in others. That being said, the overvaluing of rationalism is gravely dangerous. I think a great example of this is the French Revolution. That you go through, it starts off as rationalism is used as a tool to poke a hole in the bark of Peter. But ultimately it goes way too far, and that you're actually removing the organ of reason. And what is left in the society? The people who you needed to help you rebuild your society are no longer with you. So it's essential that we leave room and are able to elevate our consciousness beyond the limitations of instinct and even that of thinking into the third of the trinary of this ancient depiction of the constitution of the human being, that of a spirit. And so the world of the spirit is essentially in our nature the closest we can come into the approach of that of the world of the divine. That borderland between the portion of the reality that we experience of the divine and our own efforts and our own movements of consciousness. As we transfer and create some foundation of wholeness, we are able to have a amount of vision that we can perceive and look beyond the limitations of the abyss and see that repository of souls, spirits, who are waiting to greet us with open arms and welcome us home. So the experience of the divine comes from the closeness, from the permeability of those veils, from the becoming more and more coarse that we can see through, like that vision of the heavens that is like a cauldron held up above the earth where the light shines through from the other world. So even though reason will tell you, of course, we know that's not the case, there's fusion reactions creating light that's throwing it at the speed of light to us. And look, that is not the thing that's important. There are things in this world that are truer than facts. And overvaluing of rationalism is the ultimate defeat of the real. And the real, I'm talking about the reality of the other world. The reality that you are also. the reality that we're all participating in and partaking of, and God willing will become more and more. So this constitution that the human being is also corresponds to the sort of, and I'll use kind of a new age word here, the spiritual evolution of the human being. Essentially, the Greeks felt that the human being had the potential, every single person had the potential to become a hero. And a hero is someone through the exercise of heroic virtue can lift themselves up out of the limitations of normal, banal human life. That you can have an approach that you can be recognized by the gods for your deeds and the experiences that you've had. Next is the ability to become a demigod. This is, we see this in figures like Hercules and others, where you actually have the apotheosis of the transcending the limitations of your own humanity. So this is something that everyone could do if they displayed the proper kind of virtue, courage, and consciousness. Essentially, we have in this the myth of the elevation of consciousness. And, this was usually done, the hero didn't do it by staying, in the mountains or being the hermit in the cave. The hero was able to do this by going into the world. Going into the world of the living and going, who's there. All the knuckleheads we don't want to deal with. All of the people who are going to give us all kinds of trouble. All of the chaos. We have to go to Thebes. So entering into that, consciously engaging, consciously having the confrontation with our shadow self, with our lower nature, with our own limitations. We have the potential by meaningfully integrating the lesser aspects of ourselves. And, as the great Kabbalist Isaac Luria said, all of the aspects that you're related to, all of the souls that you are, that are dispersed throughout the world, God will make sure that you find them. And when you find them, it's part of your own transcendence, part of your initiation into the Gnosis. It also bestows upon you a kind of responsibility, where it's no longer acceptable for you to ignore those who are suffering. That the transformation of consciousness has a very effectual result, and that result is spontaneous righteousness. That you have an obligation to help your brother and your sister because you are your brother and your sister. It is a part of your initiation that cannot be ignored. Can't turn your back on it. It's part of the deal. You got to do it. So, this is, rather than it being compulsory, it is something that because of the character and the integrity that you developed, it's how things are. So let's talk about our subject tonight, magic proper. Magic, coming from the Indo-Aryan root word mag, meaning greatness. And so this means different things to different people. Like, for instance, there is the stage magic, which is, sleight of hand. And essentially, I think the keynote is the hand is quicker than the eye. Is really a burlesquing of something that's true, that's been around in the world for a very long time. If we think about apostolic time, essentially, one of the things that the Gnostics always said is the thing that's most important about Jesus, the figure of Jesus the Christ, is not that he performed miracles. Because at that point in time, we have Apollonius of Tyana and many others, Simon Magus. These thaumaturgs or miracle workers were kind of a dime a dozen. This is just, I remember being a young student at an Episcopal school and asking the priest, why is it different now? Why is it that in apostolic time there were all of these miraculous things that are happening? Why isn't it different now? And he gave me the best explanation, which was, they aren't different. The human disposition is different because we have an overvaluing of reason. And we are cynical and dismissive of things that are miraculous. I think an antidote to this is certainly what Jung describes in his collected writings in his volume called The Symbolic Life, where he talks about a kind of a magical comprehension of reality. In other words, a model of reality where the symbols that you experience every day in your life, they speak to you in a greater depth and dimension than that of the facts. That you don't ignore the archetypal realms that are calling out to you, that you are aware of them. And you place the proper valuation of the correspondence and communication that you're receiving. So this is the same kind of magical and imaginative thinking of antiquity, and also that's required for beginning any kind of magical practice. So beginning these things, one of the last people to sort of participate in the relay race of the late 19th century ceremonial magical orders known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. His name was Dr. Israel Regardie. He always said, in fact, I believe it's in the forward passage to his book on the Golden Dawn. He says it's essential for anyone who is contemplating beginning study and practice of a magical nature, of being involved in these kinds of mystical orders, that they expose themselves in a preparatory manner for several years of psychotherapy. Now, I think this is a pretty good idea. I'm someone who thinks that psychotherapy is very useful. It has its own model of reality, and I think even Dr. Jung would say this is a model of reality. A model is not the truth, but it is an approach to that reality that's helped a lot of people, and it works. It's not perfect, but it works. So that this kind of thing is necessary. Why? Because many people who are unbalanced, who don't possess a kind of integrity that would be necessary for this kind of approach into these very energizing worlds of magic, that it is, that they're attracted to it. It's sort of the moth to the flame. That having Dr. Regardie many times would dissuade people from beginning these kinds of practices before they would engage in this kind of preparation. One of the things people talk about with magic is there's a great deal of danger being involved with magic, that you shouldn't do it because all kinds of terrible things happen. And there's the story of the 4 Kabbalists. One goes into the garden of pomegranates, becomes an apostate, one loses his mind, one dies instantly, and the 4th one makes that okay. And so this was kind of a warning, be careful. Before you engage in these kinds of subjects, that you should be 40 years old, married, and have a full stomach. That being said, the greatest of all Kabbalists, the one who is essentially the Kabbalist who brought us the occult foundation of the Western mystery tradition, Isaac Luria, died at 38. So obviously, this is not literally true. Obviously, these are symbols that sort of, in a way, if you hear them in the beautiful symbolic language, you can hear that, you need to have your life together. You need to be stable. You need to not be carousing for members of the opposite sex. You need to maybe have a job or not need a job. You need to be able to have, be at a point in your life where you can be devoted to things that are not related to your instant survival or your acquisition of stuff. So many people are. I think also many of the people who come to the secret societies, and particularly to magic, they are coming with mercenary motives. What I mean is, the thing that people are most afraid of when they talk about, difficult and dangerous magic, what are they talking about? They're talking about hexes. They're talking about curses. They're talking about, having people cast love spells on them against their will. Maybe being made angry against your will. It's kind of something that could be a little scary if things are happening in your world. It's like, well, maybe the reason why things aren't going the way I expect is because there's someone who's cursing me or hexing me. You never know. But I think the likelihood is that I think there's an admonition that is, the idea that the people who can curse you, the people who can use magic and kill you, it's not a normal thing. It's not really something that you're going to encounter. Maybe in India, there's people who can use black magic and bad things can happen. But I think much more likely and in a much more common way, the West is filled with unconscious black magicians. People who have negative feelings towards others, that they're welling up all of this unconscious magical energy, and it's not something that they belong to a tradition. There's not some dark black coven. There's not a black lodge. It's just, that's not how things are here. But I think the same thing is true. These mercenary motives, what do they come from? What do we need to be afraid of? What is the magical substance in our reality, in our world now that people use to lord power over others? Money. There's all kinds of ways that people do very negative things to others. Mastery is not subjugating others. And, if you need to be lifted up by causing other people to bow low and kneel, well, I think it's surely necessary and appropriate for you to undergo some kind of initiatory modality where you can gather an integrity that you don't currently possess. Because that is not the right way. Essentially, anyone who would use any of the magical motifs or modalities for anything other than getting to God, well, they're profaning the mystery. It's not the right way. There are people you can go to. There are the miracle rabbis in Brooklyn. Sort of the heterodoxical descendants of the Baal Shem Tov, of the Hasidim, who you can go to and, make sure that when you go to Israel that you won't get blown up. Or that you can, if someone crossed you in business, that you can curse them. Or that you can curse them when they're dead. When you hear those words coming from your mouth, when you have that much anger in you that you would ask someone to do that for you, it's not going to work out. Mercenary motives are a check that are present in Freemasonry, that are not present in all the other esoteric orders, but that we as conscious human beings, we as Gnostics have to have. Essentially, the motif of the human being here on earth, the character in the Gnostic mythos that is most important, it goes beyond the imitation of Christ, which is certainly noble and admirable, but that of taking on the character of the Virgin Mary, the mother of the Godhead. The reason why that is the archetype that is important for this kind of work is that you become the wet nurse for the divine child that is being born within you. Ultimately, the goal of all magic, ultimately the goal, is not to subjugate anybody else, but rather to have the unio mystica, the divine communion with God, with the ultimate non-theistic abstract reality that for our benefit is personified because of the limitations of our understanding. So there is a way to approach this really awesome task, and it's through the thing that we've been impregnated with from the very beginning, that we have always possessed, this outpouring of the essence of God that is older than anything created. That is basically the godlet, the little God, in becoming that we are also. So we have to make sure we don't do anything to defile all of those constitutional aspects that I previously described. We have to make sure that we are the proper vessel and habitation and are able to establish and to inculcate wholeness, integrity, to become an indissoluble unity, to have a reintegration of all of our disparate parts, that they can become whole. The magic definition of the great scholar from the 18th century and the early 19th century, Eliphas Levi, is that magic is the development of the will over the powers of reality, to manifest a control over reality on purpose by the will, in sort of an exteriorization of consciousness. And so if we think about this to some extent, what magic is it's a transformation of the psyche into the spirit. That's what magic is. So if we're going to experience this externally, it's really through the means of projection, these internal experiences and confrontations that we're having, that we don't experience them here because this is so difficult to approach, that we experience them in manifestation. It's a way that we are sort of as to the macrocosm, the physically manifest is outwards for it to perceive it. Luria said, the reason there is a manifestation is because God wanted to behold God. And we, as the lowly godlet in the microcosm, we have to perceive our inner realities outwardly. And this can happen in very negative ways too. You hear people who cry out like in traffic to people who pull in front of them. They cry out the most bizarre things like, oh, I hate you ugly. It's like, ugly? Really? I hate you stupid. It's like, stupid. You hate yourself. These are things about yourself that you haven't addressed. They're coming out unconsciously with really an unholy kind of power. So the kind of magic is the magic of transcending the limitations of the personality, of the lower self, and having that conference into the upper realms. Really the inheritor of this sort of study of occult philosophy, Dion Fortune, or that's her magical name, Deone Fortuna, Violet Firth. She said that she amended this definition as being the causing changes in the mind at will. I think this goes with a standard definition of what it is to be a master. And I already alluded to mastery is not subjugating others. That's villainy, bullying, the worst that a human can do. You're in a position to lord your power, it's not the right way. But mastery, rather, is expressing oneself to the fullest extent of your capabilities, to the limits of your skill, on purpose, every time. Mastery. A true master gives credit to others. Rather than lording its power, it lords charity and love over others. So this is also a great opus, a great work of the divine work. So the word theurgy means the divine work. It's a special kind of magic. And so essentially we have here elements of ceremonial magic. And here to my right, to your left, we have some of the objects of the divinational modality. You've heard of these things, divining. You've heard of other people who sort of burlesque these things, like, for instance, in the case of fortune telling. That is not what divination is. Divination is, rather than just telling someone's future, that's, if anything, that's a side effect of the actual work of magic. The great 19th century order, the Hermetic Dawn, made sure that all of its students in their coursework would partake a course of divination, of experiencing these things. Why? So that they could stimulate their magical imagination, so that they could have a greater and greater contact with the other reality. So in the divinational motif, and here we have demonstrated the tarot and also the scrying. So these are modalities to have an experience, to reach out into the other world, into the sublunar realms, and I'll just explain that. There is envisioned in the ancient Greek terms something called axis mundi, basically an axis in which we find ourselves, and it is we are at the point of division between the sublunar realms and the superior world of the divine archetypes and superior realities. The world of angels and of beings that are holy, that we can experience through invocation. So in the divine modality, it was discovered that there are, without the human being and also within the human being, something that the depth psychologists and Theosophists and others would say is the self with a capital S. Is that version of reality that you are, that is finished. Because in other ways, there's some kind of aspect of the divine that is timeless, that is not having this horizontal experience of before, after, and coming soon, but that is in all of those places at once. And in that reality that is superior to time, an eternity is not everlasting, it's superior to that. It's also said that time is a counterfeit of eternity. That in this eternal reality, you're already done. There's a version of you that you can have access to now. This divine spark, the indwelling Christ, the Atman, the Buddha nature, the fully realized version of you. That is externally, that's the way in which we can approach God. We can approach that abstract thing that is so difficult. It's so alien to us because we have that in us in a becoming. That through the transference, the transferal of our consciousness into this other reality, that we can know more and more. So in the work of divination, we have sort of a reaching out to the other world, where we're asking for help for our condition, asking for more and more understanding of the way things are. Maybe it sounds like fortune telling. It's much superior to fortune telling. The understanding of the way things are, that's the definition of Gnosis, the knowledge of the things that are. That as we reach out, we find miraculously, and for some unknown reason, that there's something there that has a kind of wisdom that wants to reach back to us and to deliver the kind of aid and assistance to us as we suffer in this physical manifestation. And so that the kind of contact that we can have through the divinational motifs can be really very exciting, and also really kind of a shifting of gears. You have an experience of something that's real and true, that you didn't make up. It's not a paint by numbers painting where you're filling it in. It's not that your mind is like, okay, I have to think of the answer so that it can tell me. It's going to tell you things that your mind is incapable of knowing. Right? Maybe the caution and the check is that when you consult the oracle, that if you ask the question, that you should seriously consider the answer, and you shouldn't ignore it. This is also part of the becoming and part of magical thinking. It's that you learn more and more not to ignore the reality and the doors that are opening up. That you learn more and more to have an acceptance and an incorporation, an assimilation of that light. So when you stare into the crystal at the fire, when you stare into the obsidian mirror, what are you looking at? You're staring at your own face, right? So this reality is not something that you're having some phantasmagoric manifestations in front of you. It's if you were to see something, it might be like this, and it's sort of these subtle perceptions that you have to attune through contrast of limiting of those perceptions that you can benefit from, that you can receive meaningfully the interaction of these superior realities. Let's face it, this model of reality, of magic, it's also a symbol system. And its symbol system, once you become affinitized to it, you see it everywhere. And it teaches you also not to be cynical and dismissive, which is really the bane of the West. And free of any mythology, it's more like a fundamentalist's absolute limitation and destroyer of the things that are real. Because in this model, the physically manifest world that we are in, that we are, that we know and that we are able to receive from, it's only at the most 1/10 of reality. And then there's all kinds of other reality it's not even manifest, where nothing is out of phase, nothing is incongruent, that everything, light and dark, truth and error, that they are a wholeness. And so we have to, in miniature, become that kind of wholeness. So in the modality of ceremonial magic, there are several means, like for instance, the Golden Dawn espoused 3 in particular. That of divination, the second being that of something called a vision, where from India they derived sort of the innermost core of the essence of the elemental archetypes, that being of earth, water, fire, and air. And then a fifth one added, being sort of like the magical intercession, like the hermetic messenger, the visionary correspondence between the worlds, that of, it's called Akasha. And so the way that you have this experience is maybe printed in pretty large size are particular symbols that over perhaps thousands of years in India they have found being a doorway to, when you, through breathing exercises and contemplation, that essentially that you can go into that world like a door. I think the same can be done with the tarot. contemplating and meditating the tarot, all of, you don't really even have to have a tremendous knowledge of the data, that there's such a compacted set of symbols there that speak the language of the soul, that you don't have to know the details, that you can go there, that it can be an inspirational sort of quest that draws you deeper and deeper into the mystery, that those things are there on purpose. And I would just say also as a caution, if you, for instance, are someone who is dabbling in the tarot, really, let's face it, there's nothing worse than a dabbler. Someone who doesn't literally approach these things in a meaningful way, that they just do it here and there willy-nilly, you're not going to get very far. It really is essential that you have a devotion and understand all of the background and meaning, even if it is, your approach to magic is that you're going to exactly follow instructions until it works, and then when it doesn't work, you can break it. That's okay. But it's essential that you have a kind of obedience to the practice that you're engaged into, where at first you are able to seriously have the devotion, seriously do what's asked of you, and subjugate yourself to the tradition that we've all inherited. That there is a power to tradition. So many people will do things like, I'm going to paint the most beautiful tarot cards ever. I would just ask you this. Do you have an encyclopedic and Gnostic comprehension and understanding of all the symbols that are compacted there? Have you somehow translated them, or is this just an aesthetic concern? That the divination of the tarot is not fortune-telling. It's a way and a key to that door, to the divine, to the inner recesses of the archetypes that you are also, an approach to a reality that can really be a healing of your soul. That it's necessary for you to have an authentic tradition. The cup is the tradition for the experience. It holds the experience in a very precious way that guards it, to make sure that it would never overflow, that it wouldn't be inadequate to the measure of the things that are experienced, that it doesn't contain dogmas and theologies that are contradictory to the experience. The cup of the tradition is made by those who have had the experience. And it shouldn't be disregarded. Whenever you get a new job or you go a new place, you get a new apartment, first thing you're going to do is rearrange the furniture. I know better. Do you really know better? Is that the ego talking? The things that we have inherited are precious. And if we don't guard them, we will lose them. And so it doesn't mean that a new revelation can't come to you, that in fact is superior to the tradition that people have been practicing for thousands of years. It's possible. The seal of prophecy is not closed. But if you're going to be prepared for that experience, it is, I think, prudent and wise to avail yourself of a meaningful tradition that has a kind of authenticity that's coming from somewhere. Let's face it, if somebody makes something up and it's not coming from anywhere, it doesn't have that authentic ground to be, well, it's not going to go anywhere. Sometimes those things can be very impressive, but oftentimes they contain a kind of wrong-headedness that can lead people to kind of a spiritual failure, which is not desirable. The tradition of ceremonial magic is a tradition, essentially, when we talk about the last two aspects, which are evocation and invocation, where the divine essence within yourself is communing with the divine essence from the other world. Right? That's essentially what's happening. There have been formulae and schematics proclaimed for a long time. How long? Well, let's look at the chalky caves of the Ariash Mountains. Probably it's coming from there, from this archaic kind of spirituality. First you see the shaman with the horns dancing, right? What is he doing? there's nothing practical about that. But ultimately, it's much greater than anything practical, because there is an archetype that can address itself directly to the divine through ecstasy. And, there's far too little ecstasy in our world. There are some peoples that have the kind of disposition that, that only the Eleusinian mysteries will do. Or the kind of disposition that, if that's taken from you and you're instead overshadowed with a dogmatic theology that says you're no good, you know what? Maybe that ecstasy will drive you to drink. I think there are certainly conditions we can see. For instance, the American Indian experience, the incredible proclivity to alcoholism, certainly the Celts, the Scandinavians, and so forth. Speak from personal experience. My travel and my experience of the people in, I lived in Stockholm for a long time, and I lived in Mexico for a while too. There is, underneath the surface of the exoteric religious structure, there is a folk religiosity that's always been there, that's communicated to mother to daughter and so on. That is the reality that's, that's the thing is you can't cover these things up. These old gods are not going to die because people experience them directly, people with that kind of consciousness. So in the West, we have a modality of evocation and invocation. Evocation meaning to draw forth from the sublunar realms, also known as in the pagan times as being the Tartarian regions. And by Tartarus, I'm not talking about tartar sauce. It's something different, maybe more akin to something like Hades. But really, if you think about what it is at an archetypal level, it's that, right? It is that. But it's also the sort of the collective unconsciousness of the world. It is a realm of being that all of the things in the past that have ceased to be have a kind of power that they hold there. And there are denizens in that reality that have a kind of wisdom to confer. So when you hear words like Hades, you think about hell or Gehenna, or you think about demons and all of these kinds of things, and that's not what it is. There are kinds of consciousnesses there that can be approached, and for a very long time, people have accessed them through the use of ceremonial magic, of evocation, to have an experience of consciousness. And I'll say it like this. We think about, again, that axis mundi, sort of that polarized shaft that pierces to the very center of our being. And that we have maybe the realm of waking consciousness being the horizontal contingency. That horizontal reality needs to be pierced. Needs to have the intercession of the divine and the vertical. And so if our consciousness is limited to the flatness, to the everydayness and limitation of rationalism, of cynicism, it ain't going to work out. And let me tell you, in a way, Blavatsky was right. There is a kind of reincarnational karmic motif that exists at a low level. And if your soul is very small, you're going to keep coming back. You will not have done the work that has to be done. You will not have availed yourselves of the opportunities that are here to transcend the limitations of everydayness and to return to that incredible reality of the fullness that is our inheritance. Every single spirit can go home. But, we come back and again in some kind of slavery. So what is to be done? That thing that has to be done is the transformation of consciousness, the increase of the spirit. And so Certainly, we can go horizontal forever and ever. The journey to the east, we hear about over and over again. It never ends. There was a lady who said, I just got back from India. It's my 18th time, and it was so enlightening, right? The reality is, if you'd gotten what you needed the first time, you wouldn't have had to have gone back. The journey to the east is an archetypal journey, and you don't literally have to go, right? It's something that can happen to you, something that in these other worlds that we can experience, there is, like that Indo-Aryan root word, an increase in greatness. As we reach out to other kinds of consciousnesses, of the sublunar and then the superior reality of the divine beings, we are engaging with them, and in this engagement, we are having the result, an increase in consciousness, the magnification of the greatness of our souls. The image of the tradition, of the particular schematic of the evocation, is the operator, stands within the magic circle. And here, I don't know if you can see this from where you are. Afterwards, I encourage all of you to come up. This is a depiction of one particular kind of operation. This is on an obsidian plate, and it has from John Dee, the Monas Hieroglyphica and the Tetragrammaton on it. So here, some depiction of this, the operator stands. The operator stands, and he or she is calling out and calling out to the divine, issuing forth enchantments, an invocation of the superior world to come forth, to present itself in powerful manifestation, that it can be comprehended, and also there can be a communication and ultimately a union with this other reality. And in doing so, the circle that the magician stands in increases. The circle is the symbol of consciousness. And ultimately, the goal of the magical operation is to have that consciousness expand beyond any horizontal borders. And that axis becomes the field of reality that we are able to experience and to have a knowledge of, to have a uniting with that divine world. I would say this too, in my own personal experiences with these modalities of divination, of vision, of evocation and invocation, what is the result? I've read a lot of anecdotes of alchemists from the 19th century, and they are presenting all kinds of postulations of like, these are how far I've gotten. If anyone else knows how to get further, please contact me. And I read also other things in the modern version, the blog, where magicians will say, these are the things that happened, and I got scared, and I didn't go forward, and I tried this, but it didn't work out. And there are certain kinds of personalities that you think about them in a non-magical context, that would be like someone who would be very interested and fascinated by sports statistics, right? And who, when they involve themselves in these kinds of modalities, they are only able to approach it superficially. That ain't going to work out. It's required that we have a full experience of all of the senses that are integrated. The difference between magic and mysticism is kind of a darkening of the perceptions of reality, where we can touch the ultimate divine by excluding all of the other influences that would detract us from that. Sort of like I mentioned before, a kind of reduction and contrast that the vision becomes clear to things that were previously unperceivable. But magic is really the modality of the West. Magic incorporates all of the senses to the point of overwhelming the senses that you're able to go past them, right? That the vision is required, the auditory senses are required, the feeling, the touch, the taste is required. Think about this. The beautiful light from the stained glass, the feeling and the hearing of the sound of the infrasound, basically from the pipe organ overcoming your being. All of the reflections of the magical geometry coming to you, that you're having an experience of holiness, of grace, and then the taste of the sacrament. It's consciousness bestowing. We don't have to go into the darkened halls of the black robes and all of the elements here of the magician, because they are the Western modality, that all of the religious motifs partake of these things, although granted, the mystical and magical apprehension and understanding of them has been leached out for hundreds of years. But that doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean that you, as someone who is absolutely conscious and awake, can't go and participate and have those experiences. It also doesn't mean that you have to kneel at a holy altar in some secret society. But at some point, you yourself have to have your own initiation that somehow may be strengthened by the forces of the superior realities who come to you, who you don't ignore, who you acknowledge and recognize and grant them the respect and dignity that they require. That they can strengthen you, that you can have an elevation and transferal of consciousness through the wholeness that you've cultivated into that higher self where you can become more than you are. Because really the recognition and the ultimate communion with the holy guardian angel, with the divine that you will become, is the goal of all magical operations. Like I said before, if you are to have some kind of, I really want God to give me power, I want the universe to get me a better car or a better girlfriend, boyfriend, you know what, it's sort of like the reductionism of all of the thinking function. We have this is sort of the problem with the New Age and the New Thought movement. I'm going to think and grow rich. I'm going to create my own reality. You know what? The problem is we all know we're not that good at creating. And so we all know at the very bottom that the core is rotten and that the floorboards are rotted out and we're going to fall through into the road. That really what we need to do is we need to have enough courage and the confidence of our tradition and the reality of our experiences that we're not going to deny that or put that away or dismiss it as being some kind of coincidence or anything else. That we are going to fully engage with that reality, that we are going to say, I will not accept any longer straw for the nourishment for my soul. I will not any longer take a substitute, that I'm going to meaningfully engage and open myself to all of the archetypes. And I will become more than I am. This modality is an ancient modality. The sword, the cup, the pentacle, and the wand. The mind. The emotions. The intuition. And the vehicle that we are. That we need all of these to be fully engaged. We need all of these aspects to create and cultivate a wholeness, that we can properly perceive the things that are, see out of every door of reality, and not have the monolithic vision of some kind of falsehood, of some kind of self-delusion. that we are that already, that you have access to that now. If you just think, what would that finished version of me do? You know what? It wouldn't do what you're doing. You know why? Because it's hard. The thing that you're supposed to do is you're supposed to be yourself. You're supposed to have a life that is full of energy, that is full of romance, that is full of excitement, that is not dragged down to the chains of serving the Lord and the ruler of this world. You are more than that. Ultimately, there is an experience of consciousness that we are, an experience that is our inheritance, an experience that you've had glimpses of and a taste of. And I just say this, when it comes, however it comes, when you hear that knock, you have to answer. You have to say, I won't wait. I'm not going to put it off until I'm rich or until I have stability in my life or till my job gets better or these problems that I'm facing, that you have to take it now. And if you're waiting for that to happen, cultivate wholeness. Put aside the things that are obstacles between you and the consciousness that you know you're supposed to be. We have to do this. We all have this potential. And I ask also that all of you here devote yourself to the real magic that is. Not the la magie, the imaginary illusionism, the sleight of hand. You know, when someone communicates to you in a way that you know is some kind of false, projected reality, you have to say no. You have to say that there is a world of imagination. And this is not a world of fantasy or delusion, but there is a world of images. Truth did not come into the world naked. It came in the form of images and types. That there are images that are communicating to us through symbols, through every pore and every sense of our realities. And the purpose is to overcome reality itself through the total and utter integration of these symbols. We don't ignore them. We become more and more free, more and more whole. That we become that proper vessel, that the God that is becoming that we are will be here before we know. And that we have the kind of integrity that will be a burgeoning truth, an indissoluble unity that can never be denied. And I thank you very much.